Good morning and welcome. I'm Jonathan Pollack. I'm a senior fellow and acting director of the John L. Thornton China Center here at Brookings, and delighted to have all of you here for what I think is going to be a most revealing set of events. Less than 2 weeks ago, the United States and China culminated two very, very different political processes through which the leaders of the two countries were either elected or selected to serve. In the U.S. case, it was a very public and openly fought process, resulting in President Obama's re-election for a second term. In the Chinese case, the decisions were made behind closed doors and by non-transparent means, resulting in the announced appointments of new senior leaders at the 18th Party Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, most notably the designation of Xi Jinping as the new General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, as well as chairman of its military commission. This morning, we plan to review the political outcomes that we have observed in both systems, ask what they could foretell about the future political and economic directions in terms of debate in both countries, note some of the major challenges that I think confront both leaderships, and then assess the possible implications for U.S.-China relations and East Asia as a whole. Our focus, not surprisingly, will be much more on the Chinese side of the story. I think that this reflects the enormity of the challenges, both internal and external, that China confronts, the extent of leadership turnover in China, the question of whether new leaders will follow an old script or whether they will pursue very different paths than their predecessors in office. At the same time, of course, the United States confronts prodigious challenges of its own, even as President Obama must replace many of the lead officials who have been responsible for the formulation of U.S.-China policy during his first term. So the questions, it seems to me, some of them are quite obvious, but it's important to state some of them at the outset. Should we anticipate continuity or discontinuity in the bilateral relationship? How will both leaderships seek to protect and advance their interests? Will this reinforce or undermine the capacity and the incentives of both leaderships to cooperate on pressing international issues? And what, of course, are the potential consequences if there is increased stress and additional fault lines introduced into the bilateral relationship? And last, what should we be looking for and anticipating in the weeks and months ahead? I'm joined this morning by three of my colleagues from the John L. Thornton China Center and by two distinguished experts from other institutions here in Washington, and who will respond to the presentations by the panelists and then moderate the ensuing discussions. We will, of course, try to allow for as much time as possible in questions from the audience. Our opening panel will address China's new leadership and its prospects. I'm joined by my colleagues, Chung Lee. Where is Chung? There he is, right there. A senior fellow and director of research in the Thornton Center, by Ken Lieberthal, the senior fellow and past director of the John L. Thornton Center, and then to be followed by Stapleton Roy, Stape Roy, former U.S. ambassador to China and director of the Kissinger Institute at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and then this afternoon by Alan Romberg from the East-West Center, right? Stimson Center. I knew I had it, but anyhow. In any event, since Chung's presentation involves some slides at the outset, we're going to let Chung go first, and then the rest of us will join him on the stage. So Chung, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I'm honored to speak to you and also speak along with Ambassador Roy and Ken, and whose writings have profoundly shaped my thinking and writing on Chinese politics over the past 20 years. And in my presentation, I will cover three aspects. First, discuss about the scale and the scope of the leadership change. Second, main characteristics of the new leadership by looking at their career path, educational background, factional identity. And thirdly, I will discuss what I believe the main issues emerging from the party Congress and from the new leadership. Now, first, the scale and the scope of leadership change. Now, this is the overview I just completed 2 days ago. And look at the 6 major organizations elected or selected at the 18th Party Congress. The yellow color are new members. In the first column, also included from alternate to the 4 members. So out of 376, 240 are new members. It's about 64% turnover rate. In the Central Discipline Inspection Commission, altogether 130 members, 100 are new, about 77%. And the Secretariat, the organization in charge of daily affairs, very important organization, altogether 7 members, only 1 is old, so 86%. In the Powerful Power Bureau, 25 members, 15 are new members. In the Power Bureau Standing Committee, 7, and as we know, that the 5 are new, 71%. And in the Central Military Commission, and out of the 11 members, 7 are new. If you consider the military members, actually, the percentage is 70%. So it's very much as we previously predicted. Now, this turnover rate, this is a look at the compare with the previous party Congress. This is the 18th Party Congress just completed, 64%. So it's the second highest turnover rate. The highest occurred 25 years ago in the 13th Party Congress, 68%. So Chinese Communist Party, despite the one party's monopoly, actually internal turnover rate is quite impressive, probably higher than our Congress and then many European Parliament members. Now, let's also look at the institutional norm and the rules. Despite the criticism we heard, and I also will add my criticism, it is, by and large, the second peaceful transition of power. That's actually is quite a remarkable development. Now, also, some of the major norms and the rules actually follow. For example, the age limit. Anyone who was born in or before 1944 in the previous party Congress, party Central Committee, retired. And also, there's a regional bureaucratic representation. I spent most of my past 3 days just calculating these numbers. Actually, end up a very interesting phenomenon. Among the 62 leaders, the 4 members serve as the provincial leaders. Actually, as we know that in China, 31 provincial level entities. Each province or major cities has 2 people. That rule also follow, except Jiangxi Party Secretary Su Rong and Heilongjiang Governor, probably for the reason of maybe the intra-party election, eliminated. So in Jilin and Xinjiang have 3 members. So that's, again, follow the previous thing. In terms of every major ministers, there's 1 full member. Every military district, there are 2 members, and etc. So this norm largely follow. Now, also there's Chinese adopt this so-called more candidates than seats, 差额选举, started in 1987, which basically gave about 10% more candidates on the ballot. These last bottom 10% eliminated. Now, these people eliminated including the Minister of Commerce, Chen Deming, Minister of NDRC, Zhang Ping, and the Minister of Supervision, a rising star, a very, very powerful woman, Ma Wen, also eliminated. Some people are probably not in the ballots even, including Governor of People's Bank, Zhou Xiaochuan, Minister of Finance, Xie Xuren, and also very powerful military figure, Zhang Qingsheng, who raised some of the criticism early on in the past 4 months. So this is the elimination. Certainly, the most dramatic is Chen Deming. According to some sources, that he was considered as Power Bureau member and vice premier, but he could not make to the Central Committee. So that's one of the big news. Now, also, I think the most important development is Hu Jintao's decision to step down as chairman of CMC. We cannot underestimate the significance of that development, because otherwise, Xi Jinping really surrounded by two bosses, retired bosses or not retired bosses, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. By stepping down and that important position, really consolidate the relationship between the party, the army, and the state. So it's a great contribution. Now, I also should say that some of the elections, particularly the three things, norms, is not new. It started about 20-some years ago. And there's not really, cannot say any progress. The difference probably just increased 1 or 2% in terms of election, eliminated the number. 25 years, only 1%. That's the progress. So in a way, it's an embarrassment. Now, this is the top 7, the lucky 7. And several things is interesting. One is the age. 5 years ago, Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang were the youngest member of the Standing Committee. 5 years later, they are still youngest. So this means that in 5 years, there will be a major change. So battle probably started immediately after the party congress, 5 years, not that long. Secondly, these are their positions. All these positions are very much already confirmed, except Liu Yunsan, it's unclear whether he will continue, whether he will serve as vice president of PRC. That's a question mark, because rumor in Beijing said Li Yuancao, who did not make it to the Standing Committee, will be vice president of PRC. Of course, there's a possibility there's 2 vice chairmen of PRC, but we do not know. But all other portfolios is very much announced. Now, the interesting thing is, among that list, it's not balanced. Now, we divided Jiang's camp and Hu's camp. Jiang's camp, the core group, is princelings. So there are 4 princelings, plus another person, Zhang Gaoli. So it's really at least 5 versus 2. Many people in Hong Kong believe that Liu Yunsan, although he has an affiliation with Tuanpai, the Communist Youth League, but really he's even closer to Hu Jintao. So it's really 6 versus 1. So that's the main issue. I think foreign media and the domestic public reaction certainly focus on that. Now, this is the entire Power Bureau, except the 7 Standing Committee members. Their positions are very much decided, although there's still some changes in the State Council membership and etc. Now, the interesting thing is that in the Power Bureau, Hu Jintao's camp actually had more seats. So ultimately, it's more even, these 25 members. It's very much like 13 versus 12. So in that level, you do see the balance in the Power Bureau. Many of them are Communist Youth League, Tuanpai. Now, this is the new secretariat, which is in charge of the daily events. And only 1 member is old, Liu Yunsan. And these are their portfolios. Liu Qibao will be in charge of propaganda. Zhao Leji today already announced will be organizational head. Li Zhanshu will be in charge of general office, replacing Lin Jihua. United Front, Du Qingling, although he is not the director, he was a former director. And Zhao Hongzhu will be in charge of discipline. He is the number 2 person in the discipline commission. And Yang Jing, a minority himself, I think Mongolia, will be in charge of ethnicity and religion. Now, based on that, you will see the more emphasis on religion and also ethnicity being the secretary. Previously, there's no such a position. Such that position belonged to the United Front. Now, interesting also, this is not listed here, at least 4 members of Communist Youth League started their career. And this is Liu Yunsan, as I mentioned, half. Liu Qibao is Tuanpai. Li Zhanshu is also half. And Du Qingling is for Tuanpai. And Yang Jing is also affiliated with Hu Jintao for 30 years in the Communist Youth League. So in the secretary, Hu Jintao has upper hand. Now, this is the early on, before the party congress, talk about the 10 members of the Central Military Commission. As we know that the 7 of them retired because of age, 3 of them remain. And they indeed remain. But their position in the Central Military Commission quite different. One become vice chairman, 2 actually remain as just members, not as people predicted as vice chairman. So this is the 11 members of Central Military Commission. All of a sudden, Fan Changrong and had like 2 or 3 steps promotion. And Xu Qiliang remained in the Central Military Commission, promoted to vice chairman. Now this is the Chang Wanquan, supposed to be also vice chairman, but did not get it. He will highly likely become Minister of Defense and the State Counselor. And these are the other important positions in the military. Now, also 7 of them are new members. So out of the 10 military members, 7 are new. Now, this is the composition, likely composition. It's not announced. There will be still some changes in the next State Council. But most of the rumor in Beijing, in the inner circle, have that kind of version. As we know that these first 2 are already decided. Liu Yuandong will become vice premier in charge of agriculture. And Wang Yang will be in charge of state-owned enterprises, industrial development, replacing Zhang Dejiang. Ma Kai, who got a position from Chen Deming, originally Chen Deming is on for that position, was in charge of finance and trade. And Wang Funing, state councilor, because based on Beijing's rumor that he will take a portfolio of Liu Yuandong in charge of education and culture affairs. Chang Wanquan, military, DOD, and Jiang Yikang will be state councilor and also general secretary, chief of staff. And Guo Senkun will become a state councilor in charge of police, will be also minister of police. And finally, Ji Bingxuan, this is a surprise. I still have difficulty to understand. And he will replace Dai Bingguo. Now, this may not happen, but that's current version. That person does not have a foreign affairs background, largely moved from the Chinese Communist Youth League and also from propaganda. And currently, he serves as party secretary of Heilongjiang. Now, this is a really big surprise. None of the foreign policy apparatus make to that short list. But they still keep the 4 members of the Central Committee, including Yang Jiechi. There's a possibility Yang Jiechi could become state councilor. There's also a possibility that someone like Wang Funing will be in charge of foreign policy. It's unclear. Wang Yi also makes the 4 members. Wang Guangyang, promoted from alternate to 4 member. Wang Jiarui, previously, still currently, international department head. And Zhang Zijun, party secretary of the foreign minister. And Peng Qinghua in charge of Hong Kong affairs. So these are the foreign policy team in charge of various affairs, including Taiwan and Hong Kong and etc. Now, the 4 financial teams, this is not the 4 list. There are a lot of more important figures than that. But these are the new members, including Xie Fuzhan, a protege of Wen Jiabao, and Liu He, a childhood friend of Xi Jinping. He has a nickname as China's Larry Summer. I don't know what's good or bad, but he is quite brilliant. And Gao Fuchen also probably will replace Chen Deming as Minister of Commerce, although someone said Tianjin governor will be the Minister of Commerce. And Li Wei, Zhu Rongji's Mishu, also make the 4 members of the Central Committee. Now, these 2 currently work for the State Council Development Research Center. I think at least one of them will move out to be in charge of financial affairs. Now, interesting enough, these 3 are really returnees. But overall, the returnees is very, very limited in the high level. In the Power Bureau, last time was 1. Zhang Dejiang got his degree from North Korea. This time, the same. But the 2 people had the visiting scholar experience and 1 year overseas, including Wang Funing, who studied at Iowa and also worked under Ken Libersor, right? He's a visiting scholar. And another person is Sun Zhengcai, who spent 1 year in UK. So that's it. But the low level, I'm still doing calculations. It's not clear. Maybe another occasion I will release my report. Probably more, I think. But the high level is quite limited, only in the financial sector and etc. Now, very quickly to second things, main characteristic of the new leadership. Several things. First is their career path. Now, this is the 25 members of the Power Bureau. Their previous main experience, actually, 19 of them, about 76%, 3/4, have the experience serve as provincial party secretary, governor, or major city like Shanghai, Beijing, party secretary, and mayor. So that is very important. So still, provincial leadership is the main career path. Secondly, this is a rise and the decline of technocrats based on my previous study, also based on cancer study early on about these leaders. You can see that minister and provincial party secretary governor in 1988, 1982, almost zero. Only one person, Li Peng, at that time, was in the minister. But the 1987 increased dramatically. 1997 reached the peak, about 70%, I'm sorry. And 2008 started to decline. Now, this decline very clear in the current Power Bureau. The red color is a standing committee. The blue color is Power Bureau. This is from the various years. And as we know, that 14th Party Congress and also 16th Party Congress, all the standing committee members are engineers turned politicians, therefore all technocrats, 100%. But it started to decline last party Congress when Li Keqiang and Xi Jinping and many others like Bo Xilai and entered, so decline. Now this time, in the standing committee, only one person, Yu Zhengsheng, is a technocrat. And in the Power Bureau, only a few of them, 16%. So we should really see dramatic decline of technocrats. Now this chart, probably for most of the Western audience, is not a big deal, but in China, could be sensational. Because leaders always claim they have advanced degrees, right? But then look at these degrees. Most of them, the advanced degrees, 88% are part-time degrees. Part-time degrees in China means a lot of things, right? Now, only two, I think Wang Funing and Ma Kai really finished their master degrees full-time in the middle or early 1980s. Now, also surprisingly, in the undergraduate level degrees, 8 of them, 32%, also part-time degrees. Now, this you will see in a very meritocratic-oriented China could be a serious criticism. Although, on the other hand, I think some of the leaders are very capable. If they can prove their capacity, certainly fine. If not, this will be some criticism. Now, the most important things is about the rise of princelings. This is in the Power Bureau Standing Committee. Look at from 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. In terms of total number, in terms of number of princelings, in terms of percentage. So this is highest ever, 57% of princelings. As I mentioned, 4 members, right, are princelings in the 7. The Central Military Commission, and the good news is the 2 princelings previously on the running, Liu Yuan and Zhang Haiyang, are gone, actually reduced the percentage. Otherwise, probably will be half. But now it's 36%. Still, compared with the previous years, it's unprecedentedly high. This is the criticism, particularly at the time, people very critical about the corruption. And I will finish in 2 minutes or 3 minutes, it's okay? Now, last point, the main issues emerging from the Party Congress. I think 4 major issues. One is, for me, for many observers, it's a disappointment that they did not adopt the more candidates than seats style election to the high level, meaning the Power Bureau. They discussed that, but eventually dropped. Let's imagine if they introduce that mechanism, no matter whom they elect, that really gives them a new source of legitimacy and new sources of mandate. But unfortunately, that did not happen. You know, actually, most of the candidates could still get to the Power Bureau and the Standing Committee. Only maybe a few will be eliminated, but still, because those of people who scared they will be eliminated resist strongly. So in that regard, I think it's a very big disappointment. It's opportunity missed. Second, it's a factional balance is really broken in the highest level. That will be very, very costly. Yes, Jiang Zemin's camps have won a lot of seats, but they will pay huge price, may pay huge price in the years to come. And thirdly, it's good news. Because now Xi Jinping has his own team. Previously, we criticized this kind of check and balance between these 2 factions, sometimes constantly led policy deadlock, could not really move, particularly regarding economic and foreign policies. But now Xi Jinping has his majority, and most of them are really capable in terms of economic reforms. They work around the financial economic sectors in the coastal regions. So in that regard, could be a very good news. They can resolve or reduce some of the policy deadlock. And finally, is because of Li Yuancao and Wang Yang could not make to the Standing Committee, as some people, liberal intellectuals, argue, particularly in the case of Li Yuancao, and because of lack of opportunity, real election, So I think the political reform will delay. My sense is the new leadership will continue to push for even much bolder economic reform, because people said that Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao did not do well in terms of economy. So now there's a good opportunity for them to prove they are capable economic administrators, may uplift the public confidence. But at the same time, we know at this phase of China's economic development requires political reform, requires rule of law, requires serious effort anti-corruption, but which is lacking. Thank you very much.
To follow Chung with some additional takes on the 18th Party Congress and what it portends. It's always fun to follow Chung. I get up here thinking there's nothing to add, given the scope of his remarks. But I'll cover some of the same ground, but you'll see I'll come at it from a quite different angle and hope to add some additional food for thought. First, on the Congress itself, I thought overall this was not a very good show. It was divorced from public view, inviting on social networks, and frankly, I was in Beijing during part of the Congress, just talking to everyone, a lot of popular ridicule in how it was being conducted. There was factional bargaining clearly until the very last minute. In fact, it went through part of the Congress. There were ugly revelations going back to last spring that continued right up to the eve of the Congress. The final choices, I would argue, were not necessarily driven by proven capability. I mean, all of these people at the top obviously have a lot of capability, but when you look back at the records, it's not at all easy to make the argument that those who have demonstrated the greatest capability in problem management and executive initiative and so forth were the ones who made it onto the Standing Committee. Overall, I think this highlighted and symbolized within China how outdated many aspects of the political system have become given current realities, socially and otherwise, in that country. There were some silver linings in this cloud. Chung mentioned a couple of them. Let me highlight to some extent the ones he indicated, but then also add some to the list. The Politburo Standing Committee was reduced to 7 members. I regard that as a good thing. Increases the chances of getting the kind of consensus necessary to make serious decisions. I agree very much with Chung that Hu Jintao's willingness to give up his position as head of the Military Commission was very good news. It resolves a kind of anomaly with several precedents in China that produced a very awkward position for the incoming party secretary and president. All Politburo Standing Committee members are from the previous Politburo, again highlighting the kind of rules and continuity that you generally see in China. Age limits were adhered to, and this Chao, the notion of having more candidates than positions for the Central Committee did have some consequences and was a policy that was continued from the past, albeit, as Chung noted, not expanded. The political report, which is the kind of major programmatic document for the Congress that Hu Jintao gave on at the opening session, but let me note it was Xi Jinping who oversaw the drafting of that report over a period of months before the Congress actually convened. As was widely noted, that report gave strong endorsement to continuity and to the accomplishments of the past 5 years. Not surprisingly, Hu, on his way out, affirmed that he had done a very good job along with his colleagues. But there are a variety of lines and paragraphs sprinkled throughout the report that can be used by the new team, if they wish to do so, to pursue some real departures. And we've seen this before, where what seems like an overwhelmingly kind of conservative, more of the same kind of document has a few things in it that in retrospect you see provide justification and legitimacy for significant new departures by the new people who take over. Here I would note a strong endorsement of the separation of government from enterprise, 政治分开 for the Chinese speakers here, stronger endorsement than I have seen. It's always mentioned en passant, but this time it really got a very strong plug, and I thought it's a very important thing for them to pursue. The notion that everyone, and they stressed everyone, is subject to the law, regardless of the level of political position, some nods in the direction of a more independent judicial system, and so forth. A number of things there that could be run with, even though there were other major parts of the report that seemed to move in the opposite or at least a significantly different direction. So all of those things to me are elements that are somewhat positive coming out of this conference. More mixed was the fact that while I think they appropriately and understandably had a major focus on corruption and the need to deal with it, they equally strongly said it is the party that has the problem and it is up to the party to fix it, which is to say they're not going to go outside of the party for any kind of independent judicial or other body to clean up corruption in the party. They're going to rely on a corrupt party to clean up its own mess. And I think that's unfortunate because I don't think it has a very substantial chance of success, even with someone as capable as Wang Qishan leading the effort. Within a very constrained set of choices, if you look at the kind of rules of the game in China, they decided to select, in addition to Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang, the 5 oldest people who were eligible for Politburo Standing Committee membership. Given my age, I think that was a wise decision. I'd like to see that precedent. Even older would be a little better, but no, but seriously, what this does is to set up a major transition 5 years from now. And 5 years from now, you know, you can never be sure, but there's a good chance that Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang will have much greater say in who comprises the rest of their team. This was a choice of 5 out of 8. There were only 8 people they could choose from, given their rules, and they systematically went for the 5 oldest of the 8. On balance, I think this succession showed both the partial institutionalization of the system and the sharp limits to date on that institutionalization. Let me now turn to look ahead. And here I want to posit 8 givens. In other words, 8 things to me that are clearly the case, and then make some additional judgments based on those 8 as framing background. They are as follows. First, there is extremely widespread and serious recognition of the pressing need for major reforms. This is in terms, the recognition is not only in terms of social tensions, of which there are many, and they are obvious, but also the analyses by key economists, by key environmental specialists, by key people in the security arena, and so forth. So there is thus great pressure both inside and outside of the political system for major reform. Second, reforms need to be both economic and political. All of the major economic and social problems, such as inequality of wealth, environmental degradation, over-reliance on exports and fiscal investment, land seizures, massive corruption, and so forth, result from how the political system currently functions, not solely from economic policies. And therefore, political fixes are necessary as part of dealing with these sometimes seemingly purely economic issues and sometimes broader issues. Political reform here need not seriously move toward Western-style democratization, but failure to deal with deeply ingrained political practices will sharply limit the economic and social improvements that can be generated. Third, reforms are necessary in the coming 2 years or so to avoid very deep problems a decade from now. In this regard, China is kind of like the United States. We have major decisions we have to make in the next 2 years to bend the curves. And if we don't bend the curves on expenditures and income, 10 years from now, we are in deep, deep trouble. I would argue with all the details are different in China, but that fundamental reality is the same. They've got to make some major decisions that they've already outlined, but they haven't implemented. They have to make major decisions to implement those changes in the next couple of years, or if you look at the curves, they're in deep, deep trouble 10 years from now. Fourth, Xi Jinping has not made his priorities clear either internally or publicly. And his past record suggests that he is both capable and cautious. So, I've seen speculation about his priorities and how strongly he'll pursue them almost across the board. Again, in China, I've talked to a number of people who you would think would know, and they're all over the lot too. So it's a little bit like Barack Obama in 2008. You can pour any content you want into this general image. We'll have to see what content is really there. Fifth, most other Politburo Standing Committee members likewise have not tipped their hands as to where they stand, either on individual reforms or on their overall priorities. You've got to keep in mind, you can have a group of people, everyone favors reform, but in a political system, you have to decide what's your top priority? What are you willing to really use your political capital for? And what's your second biggest priority? Because you're unlikely to get to your third, right? You see Obama facing that now with, climate change, a fiscal deal, immigration, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? The issue isn't whether he supports all of those, it's what is he really willing to go to the mat for, right? And I think what we face on the Politburo Standing Committee may be a lot of people in favor of reform, but we don't have a clue as to whether they're prepared to go to the mat for the same reforms, right? And therefore whether they can reach agreement on tough decisions with an agreed upon priority for those decisions. The candidates who did tip their hands as to what changes they would like to see did not make it onto the Standing Committee. Bo Xilai early on, Wang Yang, and Li Yuanchao. Sixth, factional ties, Tuan Pai and Tai Zedong, that Chung gave us some information on, I think do not get you very far in anticipating substantive positions and priorities. That's a level of detail that broad background relationships and associations with various top people over a period of years doesn't necessarily get you to. But substantive positions and priorities are very important for anticipating what the future is going to hold. Seventh, substantively, serious reform is a very complicated matter, much more complicated in China than in the US, given the array of reforms that are really core to each country's future. So you need to take that very complexity into account when you try to anticipate what's going to occur there. In China, this requires changes in the development model that China is pursuing, and basically changes from the former model to at least what they've anticipated, in fact, what they've stipulated in the 12th five-year plan, and longer term, something close to what's in the World Bank DRC report that came out last spring. These are very complicated and wide-ranging changes. There are deeply rooted vested interests that will oppose parts of the 12th five-year plan, and these are very powerful interests. Just to tick them off, local territorial and party leaders, local territorial political leaders. This is in part because they benefit enormously from the current development model, and they have a lot of power within their own bailiwicks and a lot of flexibility. It's in part also, I've been startled as I've begun to get into this issue a little more. Many of these positions are now bought and sold. So that this is not necessarily a meritocracy moving up. People have to handle themselves effectively in these positions to move on, but then which of those people moves on is dictated a lot by how much money you made and therefore have available to purchase the next higher level position. With a 5-level political system, some 80,000 of these 40,000 territorial units, therefore, if you just look at the top 2 people in each, 80,000 people you're talking about, many of whom have purchased their positions and see them as a basis for future wealth, not easy to carry out reform that changes the incentives and changes the options. SASAC level SOEs, the big national level state-owned enterprises, many of which are now tied to elite families, elite political families. Again, many of the reforms will be resisted from them. And many of the ministries resist reforms. And I think what we'll see in the upcoming MPC is the greater move toward the supra-ministries. And I think that, frankly, that is not necessarily going to help reform. You could argue it either way, but that's my instinct. Tough reforms will also require disciplined decision-making on the Politburo Standing Committee. That runs against the grain of the way the Politburo Standing Committee actually functions, which is a division of labor, as Chung laid out. You can tell, what each one's responsibility is, plus a consensus decision-making rule. Not a majority, but a consensus. You put those two things together, it is very hard to get decisions that run seriously against the grain of people in the bailiwicks of any of the members of the Standing Committee. You can get decisions to spend more money. It's hard to get decisions that really disadvantage key groups. We'll have to see whether they alter that system going forward. And such reforms are also going to require tackling very sensitive issues. I would argue tax reform, the hukou system, commercialization of land, the scope of the state's role in allocating scarce resources and permissions, and so forth. These are not easy issues to handle politically in any kind of political system. So reforms are complicated. They touch a lot of serious interests. They run against the grain of the current distribution of power in many ways. And then eighth and finally among the givens, this is a transition period until the March National People's Congress. Given the likely large-scale reorganization of the State Council that we're going to see in March, even beyond March, when the new people are there, you have to assume it's going to be some period of months at a minimum before everything is kind of settled down. And I think you're unlikely to get any serious reforms actually implemented before you have the State Council settled down and the transition really over. Therefore, what should we expect from the 18th Congress? And I'll move through this very quickly. I think she may try quickly to set a new tone, less jargon, more populist, focused on corruption and so forth. Although I will say I just read his speech to the first study session of the new Politburo, and it was not encouraging in terms of moving away from jargon. It reminded me his graduate degree is in Marxism. But both Xi's real preferences and especially his operational priorities, I think, will only be revealed over time. The record to date, again, I think, does not provide sure guidance on this issue. Let me conclude with some comments on each of three broad categories of issues and what we might look for in each if we're going to see significant reform take place. On restructuring the economy, again, I think we'll have to wait until the latter part of 2013 at least before we really can reasonably look for any of these things on a significant level, but let me indicate some things I will be looking for. First, they will reconfigure, or they will have to reconfigure interest rates in the state banking system to provide substantial positive returns on household savings. That should be the easiest of the steps that they can take. They need to adopt measures to separate the government from enterprises. I think that is very tough, and frankly, it runs against recent trends. I think they'll have to open up what are currently either monopoly or quasi-monopoly sectors of the economy dominated by major state-owned enterprises, and do so in sectors that are actually attractive economically for private firms to get into. Opening up railways, as they have done partially, you can't make money in the railway system now, so it's not. There are very few private firms that would have any interest. If you get into financial services and other areas where there's real money to be made, that's a very different thing. And I think they're going to have to undertake major tax structure reform in order to create the legal basis for localities to raise a lot more budgetary funds. That's just a very short list of what they'll have to do. And frankly, even that is tough enough a short list that it may well take a perception of genuine crisis to produce major steps toward economic structural reform with its attendant political changes. Secondly, in dealing with society, I think it's very important, there is very important and relatively low-hanging fruit types of steps to take. In other words, things that are so obviously so counterproductive at this point that if they don't do these, you really wonder what they will do. Okay? My short list of that would be first to abolish the hukou system. This is now the greatest single source of inequality of wealth in China. You cannot see how they can move to household savings and especially household spending as a major driver of the economy if you maintain a system that prevents nearly 300 million people who live in cities from making serious money, acquiring serious property, and exercising their rights as urban citizens, right? They can substitute criteria for urban residents, but they have to change fundamentally the system as it currently exists. Secondly, move to a urban two-child policy. The one-child policy is a catastrophe by now in terms of the demographic pyramid in China. This at best will have only a very long-term impact, obviously, but if they can't do this at this point, you really have to wonder about their ability to take on anything that is politically sensitive. Third, establish a legal framework within which NGOs can operate more freely. For example, environment is one of the issues that they tag as one of their most important challenges. I agree 100% with that. I know of no major country in the world that has made significant progress on environmental cleanup without a vibrant green movement, an NGO green movement that can engage in political activism as well as public education. Systems are built around the interests of the polluters. They're the ones with the power in the system. You need some counter pressure, not just pressure from above, but pressure from below too, if you're going to change that significantly. Let me conclude with political reforms. They need to reconfigure incentives for local officials. It's an enormously complex task. If anyone wants to ask the question, I'll lay out why it is, in my view, almost impossible to change the development model without changing the operational incentives for local officials from the province through the city, through the county, through the township. Otherwise, their vested interests just lead them to do more of what they've been doing on the whole, regardless of where Beijing thinks it is putting its money. Secondly, they need to strengthen the independence of the legal system, hopefully to where top officials at every level are also subject to legal constraints. Third, they need to increase genuine political competition up to the township level, and I think within 5 years or so to the county level. Leaving genuine political competition vague in detail. There are a lot of different things they could do, but I think they need to move considerably beyond what they've done to date, which is loosening up somewhat the People's Congress, legislative system. Fourth, they need to effectively implement the party rules on internal policy process and personnel decisions. They keep talking about this, but the real progress seems to have been very limited. And finally, they need to seriously attack corruption. One thing that Xi Jinping said in this speech of just a day or two ago, the one thing that he really lit into was corruption, and implicitly compared China to the Middle East, because he referred to other countries that had strong one-party systems that have collapsed recently, and said we have to tackle corruption. So he recognizes certainly the scope and magnitude of the problem. Frankly, I'm not optimistic about this, but I certainly wish them well. My bottom line conclusion is that barring the perception of a major crisis that creates political discipline and leverage at the top, I think the odds of wide-ranging, very successful Chinese reforms are well below those of very successful U.S. reforms over the coming 4 years. And frankly, I don't regard that as good news either for China or for the United States. Thank you.
Ken, thank you very, very much. I should note that we've just had a very, very sobering presentation here and an equally rich one by Cheng Li. We will post as soon as possible a transcript of today's event on the Brookings, on the Thornton Center website. So we should be watching for that. Stape, the floor is yours.
Okay. I'll be looking eagerly for the transcript because I don't think you can get a better set of presentations on the significance of China's leadership transformation than we have just received. Cheng Li probably has looked in depth at the biographies, political alignments, way down to the sub-level that he didn't even get into at this time. But he could discuss the 6th and 7th generation leaders, and we're trying to analyze the 5th generation leaders. And Dr. Lieberthal has been working on the issues that he's just been discussing for literally decades. And his comments clearly reflected an in-depth knowledge of the difficulties of pushing through reform in a country the size of China. This doesn't leave me a whole lot to say, but I would try to tease out some additional elements that I think are important in thinking about China's new leaders. First, one-party systems function differently from multi-party systems. And one of the characteristics is that you do not know how leaders will behave until they are in the top spots, because you can't get to the top spot if you are taking a different approach from the predecessor leaders. Nobody identified Deng Xiaoping as a radical reformer, and yet he pushed through the most radical reforms in China's modern history. Nobody identified Gorbachev as a radical reformer, and yet he pushed through reforms so radical that it ended up in the collapse of communist rule in the Soviet Union and the disintegration of the country. So we have to be cautious in trying to assess exactly how Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang will perform as the top leaders. They are not supreme leaders. They have to preside over collective leadership, and therefore the attitudes of the other members of the collective are important. But they are in the most influential positions to try to shape a sense of where the country should be moving. And if there is one thing that permeates the work report, as Ken discussed at considerable length, it's the idea that there has to be fundamental reforms in China. And I think this reflects the realities of the country. But when you think about reforms, Ken went into this down to a considerable level of detail. But I think it's worth thinking about it at a higher level. What are the influences that will affect the thinking of the leaders as they look at what needs to be done in China? The first thing is age. China has, through this system of age limits, it means that every time they have a significant change in leadership, such as they've just had, the age of the top leaders is reduced. I think in the case of the 25-person Politburo, the average age is about 5 years younger now for members than the outgoing 17th Politburo. That produces a change in attitude. You also, because of this assumption of a two-term service for the top leaders, you have a curious situation where the top leaders are younger than the other leaders. There are some people younger in the entire Politburo, but in the case of Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang, they are almost 5 years younger than the other members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo. So, does age matter? The answer is it really does matter. China has gone through bigger changes over the last 3 decades than any other country in the world. I can remember, some of you may be able to remember it, the incredible change on the part of American young people between those who were part of the Vietnam War generation and the immediate post-Vietnam War generation. Serving abroad, I could simply discover in meeting people in college how radically different their way of thinking about things was, simply because their formative experience was no longer centered on the Vietnam War, but on other issues. And in many ways, that transition paved the way for the Reagan years in the United States, when the young college people were flocking into investment banking instead of communes and more radical forms of organization. Well, China has had wrenching changes similar to moving from the Vietnam War period to the post-Vietnam War period. After all, reform and openness emerged almost directly from the Great Cultural Revolution. And that was truly a wrenching change, reflected in the fact that 2 general secretaries of the Communist Party were purged in a 10-year period, simply because the changes taking place were faster than China had a stable system for managing. And in some ways, that's the issue that Ken was addressing. We have had 20 years of destabilizing, of growth at a destabilizing speed. To maintain a nearly average of 10% annual growth has produced incredibly dramatic changes in China. And it's not easy for a system to handle that and maintain stability unless it is able to adapt. And it has adapted the ideology over the last 20 years in particular, but it hasn't adapted the way of managing things sufficiently to guarantee stability in the future, and this will be an important factor. I would also like to add on this, Chung Lee has done some outstanding work in terms of establishing concepts such as the Princeling Group versus the China Youth League Group. And these are important distinctions. But there are some other distinctions that need to be borne in mind. I think, for example, in analyzing Xi Jinping, we need to look at his father, Xi Zhongxun. After all, he was a princeling. He had impeccable revolutionary credentials. He was already a revolutionary and member of the Chinese Communist Party when the Long March ended in Shanxi province in 1935. And he rose to become a vice premier of China, but he was purged in 1962. And he spent 17, 18 years essentially in the political doghouse during the period from 1962 until the opening of the reform and openness policies. This had a major impact on Xi Jinping. He had extreme difficulty in getting into the Communist Party. He had, according to some of the accounts of it, he had to apply 8 times before he found a party leader who was sufficiently courageous to be willing to move the papers forward and get him in. He ran into the same types of difficulties when he was trying to get into Tsinghua University. So in other words, he has experienced being a political pariah during the upheavals of the Cultural Revolution in China. And his father, when he was brought back by Deng Xiaoping, became the governor of Guangdong province in the south. And despite this background, impeccable communist credentials, both revolutionary and in terms of experience, and the experience of being purged, he embraced the radical changes that were being introduced in Guangdong province under the new circumstances that China was facing. So, is Xi Jinping going to be similar? If he sees new circumstances in China, is he going to feel that radical changes are necessary? Or is he going to be cautious in trying to introduce the reforms that need to be made? These are the sorts of things we need to wait and see. Not all princelings encountered the types of political difficulties that Xi Jinping encountered, and therefore we need to keep this in mind. But there's some bigger issues. China now has still an authoritarian political system in terms of the way that we Americans look at political systems. But it's almost unique among authoritarian systems in having a regularized system for changing leaders. Now, in democratic systems, we recognize that to change policies, you normally have to change systems. You have to change leaders. And China now has a regular process for changing leaders. That paves the way for changing policies. But we don't know exactly how they will be changed until we see how the new leaders perform. And this is important. Can address some of these issues. Well, if you work your way through the work report and the speech by Hu Jintao at the beginning of the 18th Party Congress, it seems to me what you see is a basic call for fundamental economic reforms and fundamental political reforms with broad concepts in terms of what needs to be done. For example, on the economic sphere, there's language that clearly indicates that the state-owned sector and the private sector should get equal treatment. There's no language suggesting a major decrease in the role of the state-owned enterprises, but there is language saying they should have equal access to the basically the capital necessary in order to thrive. And at the same time, we don't know what the details will be. So this reminds me a little bit of the financial reform legislation that Congress has passed, and in which the argument is over how the regulations for implementing the legislation are passed. I look at the real work report as basically setting broad guidelines for what needs to be done, but what actually is done can vary quite radically within the framework, even on the political sphere. As I read the political reform proposals, this is an effort by a one-party system to retain a one-party system, and only introduced, they use the term deliberative democracy. I would translate it rather as consultative democracy. Deliberation I don't think captures the idea for American minds as well as the idea of consultation. The idea is that there will be more inputs from a variety of people before decisions are made, but then they are implemented through a one-party system. But that has a long range, and as was already detailed, the fact that they are introducing the concept of having more candidates for jobs, and they may begin introducing that at higher levels, you begin to get a winnowing out process in which people who push policies that are radically unpopular will have to pay the penalty in terms of how the system functions. So I have not read literature addressing the question of how an authoritarian system functions when you have a regular turnover in leaders in which younger leaders always replace the older leaders. And that's something I think that we need to watch in China as we progress. Now, one final comment, and then we'll open for questions. Why did we end up with a 7-person Politburo? Well, you can argue it in terms of conservative policies versus radical reformers. The two radical reformers, supposedly, didn't make it onto the standing committee. But there's another way of looking at it. The 25-person Politburo that came out of the 17th Party Congress was down to 24 because of the purge of Bo Xilai. 14 of the members had to retire because of age restrictions. That meant you only had 10 candidates to go onto the standing committee of the Politburo. Previously, for 2 terms, it had been a 9-person standing committee. So if you kept a 9-person standing committee, 1 person is excluded. That's embarrassing in any system. And so the solution is you reduce it to 7. After all, the 14th and 15th standing committees were 7 persons. So there was a precedent for it. But it explains why they decided to go to a smaller standing committee, so that you didn't cause people to lose face because they were the sole person excluded. But most of the stuff I've read about has struggles, over fundamental policies. And then, as Chung Lee pointed out, the ones who made it onto the standing committee are the 5 who have to retire at the 19th Party Congress, and the 2 who didn't make it, or the 2 of the 3 who didn't make it, have the opportunity to move up to the standing committee at the 19th Party Congress because they're young enough to serve until 2022. So there may be some technical factors as opposed to policy factors that go into this. And this is why we have to be very careful in not over-interpreting the results of what has come out of the Party Congress. But the one thing we know is we have a set of new leaders. They are younger than their predecessors. This is the first generation of China's top leaders whose formative experiences have been almost entirely in the reform and openness period. They are better educated. They have more exposure to the outside world. They are more conscious of how China has to continue its progress within a global environment in which there will be trade-offs between domestic policies and international policies, and they are highly experienced. Should that make us pessimistic or optimistic? I don't know the answer to that question, but I think that the way to think about it was very nicely presented by both Chung Lee and Ken Lieberthal. Let's open the floor for questions. I think we have about...
I'm going to assert executive authority, and we're going to run a little longer because we've really so curtailed the discussion period here. Depending on the brevity of the questions and the rigor of the questions that you ask, we can run a few extra minutes. So I would say we have till about 10:40. We will have a very short coffee break.
About 15 minutes. Please keep questions short.
Yes.
Let's start there.
And please identify yourself and then ask your question.
Hi, thanks so much. I'm Jamie Strawbridge from Inside U.S. Trade. I had a little bit of a personnel question for Chung Lee. Could you just expand a little bit on Chen Deming not making it back onto the Central Committee? Is there a reason, or what do we know about the why there? And do you think that would at all affect U.S.-China trade policy going forward under his apparent successor? Thank you.
It's not entirely clear to me, but he had a history. 5 years ago, he was considered as minister of the NDRC, but he was eliminated in the first round for the 4 members of Central Committee. He did make it to be the alternate. And if you fail the 4 members, you can go to the alternate election. He did become alternate member. But the NDRC is so important, usually should be occupy a 4 member of the Central Committee. So that was 5 years ago. So this time, it's even more dramatic that he was considered even high position, Power Bureau and Vice Premier, but eliminated at least in the 4 member. Whether he goes to the alternate member for election, I don't know, because this will be decided in the 41, the chairman group to decide. It's still information, it's not leaked yet. But the reason is also not clear to me. And I met him several times, and quite impressive. And but internally, the Minister of Commerce also like him. But in terms of factional identity, he's closer to Jiang Zemin faction, actually, I should say. And but there must be something beyond me. I do not know. Yeah, anyone knows that we'll be happy to listen. But based on all the information, it's unclear. Just unpopular.
Yeah. Okay.
Hi, my name is Eric Lowe. I'm with the Fair Observer. My question is for Lee. The problem that you're talking about, like pushing reforms, like in the old days, is like Deng Xiaoping is a strong man pushing reforms. But now I think that it's getting more and more of a consensus. But you talked about like how many people are from the Hood camp and how many people are from the Jiang Zemin camp. So it seems like there is a lot of like behind-the-scenes struggle within the party. So I agree that the thing is very hard to push reforms when they have a lot of like former people still in the party. So what do you think that would be the important thing that if you need these reforms need to be pushed? So what kind of scenario you can see that could make this happen?
Very good question. First of all, I want to explain. We probably need to be a little bit sensitive about the 2 kinds of reform. One is economic reform, one is political reform. They're not the same, although Ken said so well. I agree that you need to come together. But from their old mindset, sometimes they think China should continue with so-called China model, which really have the economic marketization, but severe control of the political system. Now, that view has been challenged by Wen Jiabao, by Li Yuanchao, by Wang Yang. But certainly with that team, you can see these leaders actually quite open for economic reform. Actually, those Communist Youth League, or even to a certain extent Wen Jiabao, they have a lot of reservation with some rapid, drastic financial liberalization. They think that it will hurt China's poor people and etc. So you do see the liberals in the financial economic front may not be liberal in the political front. Now, at this point, the team we see in the 6 or 7 people, most of them are not famous for any political reform. And the fact that they resist the election certainly already make a very clear statement. And yes, Wang Jisan be assigned to the anti-corruption czar. That's great news. But he needs to find a delicate balance. On the one hand, uplift the public confidence about anti-corruption, but at the same time, not offend some of the big families and the interest group. That's extremely delicate situation. If Wang Jisan cannot do it, I doubt whether anyone can do it. But that's the situation. So bottom line is that in my reading, this leadership, they probably not for election, not for open media, but probably will reach a consensus on the area of rule of law, because it's a safe way to go. because rich people, poor people, middle class, they all think that the rule of law is important in the wake of Bo Xilai scandal. And also these elites all of a sudden find, my God, that the law could protect our interests. So that's the mindset at the moment. So I think we probably will see this kind of development. And by the way, the Brookings, we have a major event in the afternoon of 28th. And by a prominent Chinese legal scholar, very liberal, really challenge Bo Xilai and challenge the one-party rule, a call for judicial independence. We'll give a speech. We have book launch in the afternoon of 28th. And the Supreme Court Judge Steve Breyer, and also several professors from Yale, Harvard, and UK, Jerry Cohen will speak. So particularly the Ambassador John Huntsman also will be here. So
we
do
will,
sign
we will
before
put
too
out
late.
an announcement on that.
So that's the direction I think we should monitor very, very closely.
Yeah.
Okay.
John Zhang with CTI TV of Taiwan. How do you compare the new Chinese leadership lineup to the Hu administration in terms of the development of U.S.-China relations? Would the new leadership pose a greater challenge to the United States, or would it be in a more cooperative mode in terms of U.S.-China relations? Thank you very much.
Ken, do you want to take that on?
Yes, although we have a panel coming up that is on that issue. I'll give you just a couple of quick thoughts. One, keep in mind 2012 was a very difficult year for East Asia. Every single country during the course of the 2012 calendar year, China, the U.S., South Korea, North Korea, Russia, and Japan, all have leadership succession or election during that year. It inevitably makes the top leaders focused inward on leadership issues, very unwilling to appear to be in any way weak abroad and so forth. 2013 is the opposite. You would expect the new leaders, knowing they have to deal with each other for years to come, potentially have a more positive agenda, be looking forward. You know, how do we build something that's not going to impose high costs and have few benefits? And every one of those leaders has enormous domestic problems that they have to confront, and may want some more space to pursue that. So I think that there's an underlying, the kind of underlying tectonic plates are moving in a somewhat different direction in 2013. Obviously, specific events can throw that out of whack, and if you look at the details, they're pretty tough. On Xi personally, he has evinced he has some exposure to the U.S. He seems to enjoy being here. When he's been here, he has good relations with Vice President Biden and so forth. He seems to be an easier person to deal with than Hu Jintao was. At the same time, he's been the guy in charge of the leadership small group on maritime security. And that's been coordinating their policies on the South China Sea and on Diaoyu. Those policies have not been ones that make you think that he is about to make major compromises to cool things down with the U.S. and with others in the region. We'll have to see. I could see him going either way. My hope is that both sides will be trying now to figure out what a constructive agenda will look like and how to get that going as they engage during the course of the coming year.
I would add that it's still not clear what the structure of the new foreign policy team will be in the case of China and in the case of the United States. But we'll leave that to Jeff Bader to straighten out a little later. Yes.
Mike Macetic of the PBS Online NewsHour. Ken, you dropped a couple of interesting nuggets from your time in Beijing. First, could you explain to what extent your dates overlapped the Congress, and give us more of a sense of how people got their information about what was going on, and this phenomenon of independent commentary. Isn't this the first party Congress where you've had this range of independent commentary going on?
2 minutes, Ken.
Okay, sure.
There are a lot of questions out here.
I was there during the Central Committee plenum right before the Congress and talked to several delegates to the Congress. along with others. The chattering class phenomenon in Beijing leading up to a party congress is not new. Any of us who have been there on the eve of other party congresses, everyone's got the leadership lineup, everyone's got the factional stuff, and everyone ends up having been wrong, right? But it's kind of like Washington on the eve of the election. What is new is the social media side of it. That's brand new. And that, it's a little hard to know what to make of it, but the leadership certainly is very sensitive to the fact that social media is out there dogging their heels all the time and with more than a little sarcasm and humor as they do it. So there's an issue of, I think, some element of face and stature that gets caught up in this. But the, you know, China is full of strategic leaks in the lead up to a leadership change. And my experience over a number of years now has been never believe any of them. Because they are strategic leaks by insiders and even highly placed people, but in the second echelon, don't really know what is going on in the core negotiations that are taking place internally.
30 seconds. Can I respond as well? Yeah.
30 seconds.
30 seconds. Besides the social media, I think another factor is that the list was leaked about 2 or 3 weeks before the party congress. It's 95% correct. And this part of leak related to the fact that probably from the retired leaders still very, very powerful. Now, this raises the issue that the ambassador mentioned. The age limit creates a sense of fairness, but at the same time also create problems. Any leaders retire, you know, in their late 50s or early 60s, retire from various government positions. These people are very unhappy because they're still young. You know, by our understanding, you know, 50s, later 50s, not that old. And you create a huge pool. And some people, same age, but they are not on the ballots, you know, some of the leaders. They immediately make noises, like the military officers, Zhang Qingsheng, and etc. So in the future, it's really, this norm, this rule should be changed. The best way is to, through the election method within the system, to create the next level of fairness. Otherwise, it's really a bizarre situation. The pool of retired leaders is huge. Some of the senior leaders, even standing committee retired leaders, become very critical about the current previous administration, like Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, by retired standing committee members. So that's the situation, plus the social media, and also the independence of legal professions and intellectuals, both on the left and the right.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm Tracy from the Singapore Straits Times. I wanted to ask about the public security portfolio. It used to be with Zhou Yongkang in the previous standing committee, and since it's been reduced to 7, I'm wondering whether that portfolio is being handled by anyone in the standing committee, and if it's not, what is the significance of that and who's handling it? Thank you.
12 hours ago, they announced the new chairman of the Political Science and the Law Commission. This is in charge of police, that Meng Jianzhu. So it will not be in the standing committee level, will be in the party bureau level. That's an important development because in the past decade, at least the past 5 years, according to liberal intellectuals and also according to legal professions, the central problem in China is the judiciary and the prosecutor and the police under control by one person, one committee in various levels of leadership. In China, as the He Weifang, the legal scholar will speak here in about 10 days, he said so nicely, he said the Superior Court judge should report to the police chief. That only happened in China. But that's the structure because of Zhou Yongkang's position. But now that's downgraded. And there's a call in China's legal profession to completely abolish that commission, to separate these 3 entities, because otherwise it sounds like everything just controlled by the person. So it's really, there's no judicial independence at all. So that's a welcome development, but we're still yet to see how that truly implemented. It needs serious effort to go that direction.
But was it a political decision or a policy?
Political decision. It's a political decision.
Okay. Yes.
Thanks very much. I'm Garrett Mitchell, and I write the Mitchell Report. And I wonder if the panel could address the question of the political dynamics in the system. You've talked a lot about the composition of it and the issues that are being faced and given us a good look at the leadership. But you know, when they take office, how do they get things done? What happens to if Xi decides that he's got more reform in mind than his counterparts? We know what happens in a parliamentary system. We know what happens in a democratic system. So how does the leader and then how does the group? What's the dynamic look like?
Before we answer, I'm going to take one more question, and then that will end it. Yes.
Hi, my name is Joe Matthews. I'm a graduate student at American University. I'm just wondering if the factional background, is this theory sufficient to explain the actions of all the members of the top level, or are we going to see in the future development more of ideologically driven factions? Because it seems like people are just born into being princelings or marry in, or they're hired and trained as tuanpai. So doesn't seem to be sufficient to explain their actions to me.
Okay. Dynamic, and then
my sense from having looked at China for a long time is if you want to understand why things are coming out the way they do, you have to have a combination of an understanding of policy process, an understanding of bureaucratic rules that help to allocate power, information flows, and so forth, and an understanding of the real substance of the issues they're dealing with. Real substance is very important, right? It shapes a lot of things. So I tend to personally play down kind of factional backgrounds because I think all of those provide, in the broadest sense, kind of, political communities, but it doesn't get you to a policy level. And so I think that's very important. If you study China closely, this is a highly bureaucratized system with actually pretty strong rules and norms, at least at the top, for how information flows to the top, who puts it together, under what conditions do they push it up to the next level, and so forth. Obviously, we can't go through all that here, but let me say at the very highest level, at the Politburo Standing Committee level, Xi Jinping is certainly primus inter pares, right? He has the capacity to convene the meetings. He has the capacity to set the agenda. He has the capacity to sum up the discussion. Hu Jintao ran it in a way that if there were strong objections from any member of the Standing Committee, he tabled the issue for further consideration. We'll have to see whether Xi is tougher than that, right? For whatever reasons, whether he can shape it more than that. Once a decision is made, there's a very bureaucratic process for how it's implemented. What I would, which bureaucracies take the lead, which members of the Standing Committee oversee it, and so forth. The thing that I would stress overall, especially, last line. The thing that I would stress overall with the economic reform decisions is that there is a lot of flexibility for almost all of them. There is a lot of flexibility at every level of this political system. So that something that can be decided pretty clearly at the top, if you look 2 years later on what actually happened throughout the system, you find it often moved in a very different direction. And it's just at each of 5 levels, people exercising the degree of flexibility they have to contour this a little more in the direction that they prefer. And by the time you've gone through 5 levels and 40,000 units, you've got a very different kettle of fish out there. So you need to understand all that to really get a grip on what actually happens versus what the rhetoric is at the highest level.
Chung, a sentence or two.
First, to answer your question, I think Xi Jinping is first among equal, and his power has limitations. Although now he sounds like he does not have 2, retired leaders to interfere. Now he has a team that more or less, in the same factional line, so give him a lot of incentive. That's good news, but it could be also a challenge. In the future, you cannot have an excuse that because my policy is blocked. So he is the first among the equal. It's still very much a collective leadership. Now, to answer your question, I think you are absolutely right that the factional approach has limitations. But the fact is that no approach is perfect. That each approach has limitations. But the important thing is you look at today's Chinese politics in the age of collective leadership, factional politics is the most important component. This is why the public attention in China and also outside the world focus on who get in, who get out, because largely by factional line. Of course, there's some exception. Bo Xilai belonged to, Jiang Zemin's camp, but they purged him. Same case, Lin Jihua, another heavyweight, also purged, or demoted early on. But the important thing is sometimes, the leaders with scandal should be, removed. But the faction is so powerful to be dismantled. If dismantled, will be a revolution. Now, again, this is similar to a certain extent with Democratic Party and Republican Party. Do you think that all the Democrats have the same values, same attitude? No, but it's giving us a clues. They usually have their base, geographical and social economic class. The same things in China, these two factions. And if you are princelings, it's really a red nobility. It's an entitlement despite all the differences. So the public resentment of this group is overwhelming. The Tuanpai has its own limitations. They are not so reform-minded when it comes to economic matters. So the important thing is check and balance, because Tuanpai provides another alternative for this very privileged, this kind of red sun of revolutions. So broaden the power base for the party. That's important. But now you see the tendency that balance is broken or almost broken. So that's a dangerous sign. But I still think that the party has a chance to overcome that. But let's see. Certainly that party Congress gives some kind of hope, but also a lot of fears.
Okay, we'll take a break now. 10 minutes?
Yeah, a 10-minute break, but please, for the